story of the van der Linde gang is, in the truest sense, an American tragedy written in gunsmoke and dust. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a found family reaching for freedom while the world closed in around them. From its humble beginnings in backroom saloons and muddy railroad towns to its bloody end on lonely mountaintops and quiet homesteads, this gang became the living embodiment of a dying age. At the very beginning stand two men in the 1870s, meeting not as partners but as predators. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews, rival conmen who sit down to rob each other and end up sharing a fire instead, strike upon a philosophy and a plan. Rob the rich, humiliate the powerful, build a roaming family of outcasts who answer to no king, no company, no government. In that moment, their small time grift becomes a story of rebellion against a rigged civilization. But the world was changing. The railroads stretched farther, the Pinkertons grew bolder, and the telegraph wires carried law faster than any horse. The old ways were dying, even as Dutch preached that freedom could still be taken at the barrel of a gun. Between the 1870s and the end of the century, the van der Linde gang grows from a handful of dreamers into a full caravan of outlaws. Arthur Morgan, John Marston, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, Charles Smith, Sadie Adler, and a dozen more, each lost soul bringing their own scars and hopes to the fire. By 1899, that fire is burning out. The Blackwater ferry job shatters their illusion of invincibility, and the long flight through Coulter, Horseshoe Overlook, Clemens Point, Shady Bell, and Beaver Hollow turns faith into fear. Dutch and Hosea's idealistic philosophy collides with the hard reality of banks, railroads, oil barons, and a federal government determined to put an end to the outlaw dream. In their struggle between freedom and civilization, between family and survival, the gang becomes a mirror held up to America itself. Some fall early and violently, turned into legends or forgotten names. Lenny Summers dying in the streets of St. Denis, Sean McGuire shot mid-sentence in Rhodes, Kieran Duffy's headless corpse delivered as a warning. Jenny Kirk remembered only in campfire stories. Others linger into the new century. John, Abigail, Jack, and Uncle at Beecher's Hope. Charles and Sadie chasing bounties and ghosts. Dutch, Micah, Javier, Bill, and the scattered remnants drifting into Red Dead Redemption's harsher, colder world. By the time Red Dead Redemption 2 ends, the camp is gone, the tents are ash, and the songs have faded. But the story is not finished. The game leaves questions hanging in the smoke. What truly became of every man, woman, and child who rode under Dutch's banner? Which outlaws found a fragile peace, and which vanished into legend or an unmarked grave? Tonight, this is their complete story, as every fate, every echo, and every unfinished life is dragged back into the light. Tonight, the promise is simple and merciless. Every life, every death, every ghost that ever rode with the van der Linde gang will be traced from its humble beginnings to its final, flickering end. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and broken under the weight of civilization. The mission is clear: to follow every gang member from the first moment their path crossed Dutch's idealistic vision to the last line in the Red Dead timeline or in the historical record. If a name is spoken in camp, if a grave is glimpsed on a hillside, if a stranger on a dusty road hints at a familiar past, that thread belongs here. To do that, this saga will not stay locked inside the main missions. It will move through the world the way the gang once did, weaving together heists and quiet campfire talks, side encounters in forgotten towns, newspaper clippings that gloat over dead outlaws, and epilogue details that many riders never see. A throwaway line from Javier, a wanted poster for Bill, a fleeting visit from Tilly years later, each becomes another piece of a single, complete chronology. The narrative boundaries are set. It begins with Dutch and Hosea in the 1870s, two rival conmen circling each other in a bar, each planning to rob the other, and realizing in the same heartbeat that they would be stronger together. From that first shared scheme, through the adoption of Arthur and the arrival of John, through Blackwater, Coulter, St. Denis, Beaver Hollow, and the snowy ridge where Arthur Morgan dies in the truest sense as the living embodiment of Dutch's failure, the line will not break. It will run forward through John's hard-won peace at Beecher's Hope, to the last bullets of Red Dead Redemption, and even beyond, into the quiet, scattered lives that follow. Within that span, every fate matters. Dutch disappearing into the mountains only to return years later with a new gang and a deadlier philosophy. Charles Smith slipping north toward Canada, chasing a fragile freedom. Sadie Adler vanishing toward South America, her legend unfinished. Tilly and Mary-Beth finding new names and new futures, while Kieran, Lenny, Sean, and Jenny fall early, their stories ending in ditches, on rooftops, and in unmarked ground as the old ways were dying. The ideals are grand, the reality is small and human. The story begins not with a massacre or a grand speech, but with two men, a bad plan, and a shared joke that changes the West. Commit to that moment, because by the end, it will be clear not only how the gang died, but who, if anyone, truly escaped its shadow. And it all starts in a smoky room, with Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews seeing themselves, and their future, in the eyes of the man they were about to rob. The man never stood a chance. Not because Dutch and Hosea were better gunmen, but because they were better liars. Walking into that smoky room from opposite doors, each convinced he was the spider and the stranger was the fly. Dutch went first, of course. He always did. Tall, sharp-eyed, coat a little too fine for the town he was in, he moved with the confidence of an outlaw who believed he was more than a criminal. He was already talking before he reached the table, spinning a story of opportunity and injustice, of a world where men like them could seize their own freedom from civilization's grasping hands. Across the room, Hosea watched. Quieter, older even then, he measured Dutch with a thief's eye and a conman's patience. Where Dutch filled the air with philosophy, Hosea read the room, noted the exits, weighed the man's purse against the risk. From its humble beginnings, this was a partnership between a performer and an observer, between a dreamer and a man who knew how easily dreams became delusions. The joke came when the mark finally realized what was happening. Dutch's hand drifted toward his pistol. Hosea's hand did the same. Only then did they truly see each other. Two predators, one nervous victim, three guns under the table. For a heartbeat, the very beginning of the van der Linde gang balanced on a trigger pull. Then Hosea laughed. It was small at first, a dry, incredulous sound at the absurdity of two professionals stepping on each other's toes. Dutch followed, a richer, warmer laugh that turned the tension into something else entirely. The mark did not laugh. He ran. By the time the door slammed, Dutch and Hosea were already talking, already admiring the other's nerve, already rewriting the night as a story of fate rather than coincidence. Dutch was charismatic, theatrical, the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw who believed every robbery could be a speech against a corrupt world. Hosea was wry, observant, practical, and quietly manipulative in his own way, able to nudge a man without him ever feeling the hand on his back. Their first meeting did not end in blood, but in mutual respect, in the realization that together they could build something larger than a one-night scam. This was, in the truest sense, the birth of their family. A partnership forged not by desperation, but by choice, not by shared violence, but by shared possibility. They would recruit others, take in lost soul after lost soul, and preach freedom while the world was changing around them, while the old ways were dying and civilization crept closer with every railroad spike. Yet in that laughter lay the seed of tragedy. The same charm that disarmed a rival would one day silence doubters. The same cleverness that turned a botched robbery into a friendship would later twist plans into paranoia and betrayal. The man who chose Hosea that night would, years later, choose to walk away from everyone. How does a joke in a back room become a massacre in a bank? To answer that, the story has to follow what Dutch and Hosea built next, and who they brought into their fragile dream. What Dutch and Hosea built was not just a gang. It was a blueprint for a new kind of outlaw civilization, a story of men and women trying to carve out freedom in a world that had already decided their place. From the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy sounded almost noble. The government was corrupt, the railroads and oil barons were vultures, and ordinary people were crushed between them. In his mind, the van der Linde gang was a chosen family standing against that machine. Robbing a bank was not simple theft. It was, in the truest sense, resistance. They would take from the rich, refuse to bow to any flag, and live on their own terms while the world was changing around them. Dutch wrapped that belief in grand speeches by the campfire, turning every robbery into a lesson, every escape into a sermon. Freedom, he insisted, meant no masters, no bosses, no government papers deciding who mattered. The gang was the living embodiment of that dream, a roaming commune of outcasts and misfits who owed loyalty to each other, not to civilization. For a time, that rhetoric worked. It gave meaning to hunger, to cold nights, to blood on the snow. Hosea believed in the dream, but he believed in surviving it more. Where Dutch saw a stage, Hosea saw a ledger. He understood risk, limits, and the simple truth that not every battle was worth fighting. He was the quiet break on Dutch's runaway idealism, the man who would turn a grand scheme into a smaller, safer con, or walk away from a score if the noose felt too close. Dutch talked about destiny. Hosea talked about getting everyone home alive. Together, they gathered those who had nowhere else to go. Orphans like Arthur and John, women fleeing abuse, drifters with no country and no future. To them, the gang was not just a meal ticket, it was salvation. From its humble beginnings, the camp felt almost utopian. Shared food, shared danger, shared laughter. The world was rigged against them, so they would write their own rules. Who would not cling to that promise if the alternative was a prison cell or an unmarked grave? Yet even in those early, idealistic years, the cracks were there. Dutch romanticized violence, turned gunfights into poetry and corpses into proof that he was right about the world. His ego needed an audience, needed to be seen as a savior rescuing every lost soul who crossed his path. He preached freedom, but he demanded faith. He condemned tyrants, yet could not bear to be questioned. So a question lingers beneath the campfire glow. Was the Van der Linde gang ever truly about freedom, or was it always about Dutch proving his philosophy at any cost? The answer begins to reveal itself once that fragile utopia meets real pressure, when ideals collide with grief, revenge, and the first deaths that Dutch cannot explain away. That pressure finds its first and most tragic subject in Arthur Morgan. From the very beginning, Arthur's life is a story of absence and punishment. He is born to Lyle Morgan, a petty outlaw who drifts from crime to crime, never offering his son more than a rough hand and a bad example. Arthur's mother dies when he is still a boy. His father is eventually arrested and hauled off in chains, leaving a child who understands, in the truest sense, that the world offers no safety net, no structure, only cold consequence. He grows up half wild, stealing to eat, sleeping where he can, already an outlaw before he is fully a man. By his early teens, Arthur is more stray than son, a lost soul wandering a landscape where the old ways were dying and nothing better has replaced them. Civilization is spreading, but it has no room for boys like him. That is when Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews cross his path, two conmen on the road, arguing about philosophy and the price of a stolen watch, stumble on a teenager trying to rob the wrong traveler. It is almost comic, 3 thieves, no honest man in sight. Yet in that meeting, from its humble beginnings, the entire future of the gang takes shape. Dutch does not just see a pair of quick hands. He sees a project. Hosea sees a responsibility. Together, they decide to take Arthur in, not merely as muscle, but as a living experiment in their shared philosophy. Can a broken boy be reshaped by ideas of freedom and family? Can an outlaw become noble if given a cause instead of just a target? The answer, for a time, seems to be yes. Dutch becomes Arthur's teacher and preacher, filling his head with talk of destiny, honor, and a world rigged against men who refuse to bow. He teaches Arthur to read, to quote speeches, to believe that their robberies are a rebellion against corrupt civilization rather than simple theft. Hosea balances that fire with cold skill. He shows Arthur how to hunt, how to track, how to plan a job so no one dies who does not have to. Where Dutch gives dreams, Hosea gives methods. Between them, they forge the gang's first true son. To Dutch, Arthur is proof. Proof that his philosophy works, that a child abandoned by the world can be remade into the living embodiment of loyalty and purpose under his guidance. Arthur rides at Dutch's side, enforces his rules, believes his every promise. For years, he is the right hand and the quiet conscience, the man who makes Dutch's speeches real. And that is where the tragedy begins. Because the higher Arthur climbs on Dutch's ideals, the further he has to fall once those ideals collapse. When betrayal creeps in, when Dutch's dreams curdle into delusions, Arthur's faith will not just crack, it will shatter. His fate will become the moral center of the entire story, and the moment he starts to question Dutch, the entire gang's future begins to change. If Arthur is the believer whose faith will be tested, then John Marston is the doubter who never fully believes in the first place. Their story is not just a story of two outlaws, but of two sons raised under the same roof who never quite become brothers in the truest sense. From the very beginning, John's path is colder, harsher, stripped of even the fragile security Arthur once had with his father. John is left at an orphanage, then taken in by people who are supposed to care, but instead beat him and use him until he runs. He escapes into a world that does not care whether he lives or dies, surviving on petty theft, odd jobs, and the occasional stroke of cruel luck. By the time he is a teenager, the old ways were dying and civilization is closing in. But John trusts no one, believes in nothing, and has learned that loyalty is just another word people use before they abandon someone. That is when Dutch finds him, another boy on the edge of starvation, another lost soul with quick hands and dead eyes. Dutch repeats his savior pattern, the same pattern that began with Arthur. He offers John what the world has never given him: family, purpose, a place in a grand philosophy of freedom and resistance. Hosea teaches him the finer points of the outlaw trade. Dutch fills his head with speeches about honor and standing against a rigged civilization, and for a time John almost believes. Almost where Arthur grows into the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic dream, John never quite bends. Arthur wants to live up to Dutch's expectations, to be the good outlaw in a bad world, to hold on to some code even as the gang's crimes escalate. John, by contrast, is more skeptical, more selfish, more focused on survival than symbolism. He listens to Dutch's speeches, but he also watches the bodies, the betrayals, the way the gang drifts from robbing the rich and corrupt to hurting anyone in the way. Who is this really helping? Who is actually free? That difference becomes a wound. Arthur sees John's reluctance to follow orders, his disappearances, his decision to run off with Abigail and baby Jack for stretches of time, as a lack of commitment. John sees Arthur's obedience, his willingness to march into Dutch's latest grand plan, as blind loyalty to a man who is not nearly as noble as he claims. Dutch, for his part, often favors Arthur as the dependable son, which only deepens John's resentment. Over the years, that simmering rivalry hardens into something more dangerous, a fracture between believer and doubter that runs straight through the gang's heart. When Blackwater goes wrong, when the world was changing faster than Dutch can lie about it, that fracture will decide who stands by Dutch, who walks away, and who pays the ultimate price. And the first real test of that divide comes with John's disappearance, and the question that haunts the camp: did he run, or was he left behind? That question hangs over the camp, and while arguments smolder about John's loyalty, the gang itself keeps growing. From its humble beginnings as three drifters with a philosophy and a dream, the Linde outfit starts to look, in the truest sense, like a moving village. Among the first of the new faces is Bill Williamson. Not yet the blustering deserter seen years later, Bill arrives as a broken ex-soldier, discharged from the army and drifting from fort to fort, trading discipline for drink. Dutch finds him in a bar, angry at a world that used him and threw him away. Dutch talks about freedom, about fighting back against a civilization that only values men when they are useful. Bill does not understand every word, but he understands the feeling. He joins, not because he believes the rhetoric, but because, for the first time since the army, someone tells him he belongs. Javier Escuella comes from a different direction entirely. A fugitive from revolution and betrayal in Mexico, he has seen corrupt officers murder friends and call it justice, has watched the old ways were dying under the weight of foreign money and local cruelty. When Dutch and Hosea cross his path, Javier finds in Dutch's speeches an echo of the uprisings he once believed in. To Javier, Dutch is the living embodiment of resistance, a man who robs the powerful and calls it principle. It is a story of politics and romance and outlaw bravado all rolled into one, and Javier throws in with total, almost religious loyalty. Then there is Uncle, a drifter, a teller of tall tales, a man who claims to have had every disease and outrun most of them. Dutch does not recruit him for skill. Uncle barely works, barely fights, barely rides. But around the fire, with a bottle in his hand and a lazy song on his lips, he makes the camp feel less like a gang and more like home. Even a parasite can be part of a family, and Dutch understands that morale is worth as much as marksmanship. With these additions, the camp changes. There is food on the table from hunting trips, protection in numbers, shared loot after each small score. Nights are filled with music and arguments, with Arthur sharpening his knife while John boasts, with Bill drinking too much and Javier playing guitar. Some take Arthur's side, seeing him as the steady center. Others are drawn to John's rebellious spark. Most, like Charles or Tilly later on, learn to step carefully between them, sensing that this rivalry will matter. The early robberies almost feel playful compared to what is coming. Stagecoaches are stopped with a smile and a gun. Trains are robbed with minimal bloodshed. Towns are fleeced through Kant's Hosea designs with theatrical flair. It is a story of small crimes and big dreams, of men and women convincing themselves that they are hurting only those who deserve it. Yet every new recruit carries a shadow. For everyone Dutch saves from hunger or a noose, he also paints a target on their back. The world was changing, the noose of law and progress tightening, and some of these laughing faces around the fire will end up in shallow graves, hanging from trees, or bleeding out in places they never meant to die. Their brutal, unexpected ends are already written. The gang just cannot read them yet. Those shallow graves do not start in 1899. By the time the gang is freezing in Coulter after Blackwater, it is already living on top of ghosts. Some of the most important are the ones almost no one remembers. Jenny Kirk is one of them. She appears in the story only in fragments, in the way Arthur's voice softens when he mentions her, in the way Hosea's eyes seem to drift toward winters gone by. Jenny was a sickly but hopeful young woman taken in when the gang was smaller, poorer, and in the truest sense closer to its humble beginnings. Dutch spoke of freedom, Hosea spun stories of outsmarting civilization. Jenny listened, coughed into her sleeve, and believed that this ragged family might carry her somewhere better. Instead, the road killed her. Somewhere out in the snow, long before Coulter, illness finally caught up. There was no doctor, no miracle cure, no grand outlaw shootout, just a fever, a blanket, and a hurried burial on the way to the next score. For Arthur, who had watched Dutch promise that the gang took care of its own, Jenny's death became a quiet wound. He does not rage about it. He remembers. And that memory lingers over every coughing fit he has in 1899, turning his own fate into a grim echo of hers. She is not alone among the forgotten dead. Matt Callender and his brother Davy ride through the gang's early history as gunmen, trusted enough to be sent into danger, valued enough to be mourned in passing. By the time the story catches up in Red Dead Redemption 2, Mac is already gone, killed in the chaos around Blackwater, his end relayed secondhand by Javier. Davy does not even make it out of the opening snowstorm, dying slowly in the wagon while Dutch insists they must push on. Their names surface in campfire conversations and bitter asides, reminders that this family's roll call is always shrinking. The gang talks about loyalty, about dreams of a better world, about a philosophy that makes them the living embodiment of resistance to the old ways dying. Yet the reality is brutal. People die on the trail, are buried quickly, and the caravan rolls forward. Who remembers the grave once the tracks have faded? For Hosea and Arthur, those early deaths are warnings. Hosea drinks more deeply after each loss, his idealistic edge worn down by the knowledge that every new recruit might be another name carved into his conscience. Arthur becomes more protective, more skeptical of Dutch's grand plans, because he has seen where those roads end. Dutch, though, refuses to dwell. To him, looking back is weakness, and weakness is death. So by the time the gang rides into Valentine, laughing and loud, its laughter is already layered over Jenny's cough, Mac's last stand, Davy's dying breaths in the snow. This is a family built on graves, held together by denial as much as devotion. And the most haunting part? Some of the worst losses have not even happened yet. For a moment, though, the graves are quiet, and the guns are holstered. This is the gang at its apparent height, moving through the West with a rhythm that almost feels peaceful. Almost, days begin with coffee around the fire and Dutch holding court, turning every planned robbery into a sermon about freedom and civilization. Afternoons are for scouting banks and stagecoaches, watching train schedules, testing the nerves of small-town sheriffs. Nights are for whiskey, music, and the illusion that the world beyond the lantern light cannot touch them. It is a story of routine and chaos woven together, of an outlaw family trying to live in the cracks between counties and codes. Their camps become the living embodiment of that fragile balance. Coulter, frozen high in the grizzlies, is less a home than a wound. a reminder of how close the Blackwater disaster came to killing them all. Horseshoe Overlook, perched above the green heart of New Hanover, feels different. The air is warmer, the money flows, and for a brief time the gang believes it has found something close to stability. Children run between wagons, Hosea tinkers with schemes, and even Arthur allows himself to imagine that constant flight might be a way of life rather than a slow, inevitable fall. But the world was changing beneath their horses' hooves. Railroads carved steel lines across the frontier, tying distant towns together faster than any rider could travel. Telegraph wires followed, thin black veins carrying news and wanted posters from one territory to the next. A bank job in Valentine no longer stayed in Valentine. Within days, sometimes hours, Pinkerton agents knew the names, faces, and habits of the van der Linde gang. Here the gang's philosophy begins to clash with reality in the truest sense. Dutch insists that the old ways were dying only for those too cowardly to fight for them. To him, the railroad is just another thing to rob, the telegraph another tool of a corrupt civilization that can be outsmarted with enough daring and faith. He tells his people that men like them will always have a place, that dreams of freedom are stronger than wires and rails. And for a while, many believe him. Hosea and Arthur, though, watch the pattern form. Each score is bigger, each response from the law swifter, more organized, more relentless. Pinkertons appear not just after robberies, but before them. Safe towns shrink. Friendly faces grow nervous. How long can a traveling camp outrun a nation learning to move at the speed of electricity? The answer, though unspoken, hangs over every new hideout. From its humble beginnings as a band of drifters to this larger, louder caravan, the gang has clung to the idea that movement equals safety. Yet, with every relocation, from Horseshoe to the next camp and beyond, that belief becomes a comforting lie. The camps feel warm, the fires bright, the laughter real, but each one is already temporary. The gang's ideals stand still. America does not. That quiet mismatch turns every new clearing, every mansion, every swampy hollow into the same thing, a beautiful, brief illusion of safety, waiting for the knock on the door that will finally arrive. That knock has a name. Blackwater, the story of the van der Linde gang's end, does not begin in the snow, but on a crowded ferry under electric lights, with Dutch promising that this will be the last job. From its humble beginnings, every campfire dream has pointed toward this night, one score so big that the gang can finally vanish to Tahiti, to Australia, to some imagined edge of the world where civilization cannot follow. The clues come in fragments, in the truest sense a ghost told through half-finished sentences and bitter asides. A ferry stuffed with bonds and cash. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, Javier, Micah, Mac, Davy, and others slipping into a modern town that already feels like the living embodiment of the new America. Micah pushing for aggression, Hosea arguing for subtlety, Dutch caught between the outlaw philosophy he preaches and the practical risk that hangs over every move. Whatever the exact plan, the shape is clear. Dutch means to hit the ferry hard, grab the money fast, and disappear before the Pinkertons can react. Instead, the world was changing faster than he could see. The law is ready. Someone talks, or Dutch miscalculates, or both. Gunfire tears through the docks. Civilians scream and fall. The old ways were dying, and they are dying on that pier. Matt goes down. Davy is shot and staggers back to camp, bleeding out in the snow above Coulter. Innocent passengers are caught in the crossfire. A job that was supposed to buy freedom becomes a massacre that brands the gang as butchers. By the time the smoke clears, the survivors are running for the mountains, abandoning a town, a fortune, and several of their own. From that moment on, Blackwater is everywhere and nowhere. It is the story that never quite gets told, the wound everyone keeps poking. Around every camp, Dutch insists the Pinkertons were waiting, that betrayal and corruption ruined a righteous plan. He talks of sacrifice, of necessary blood. But the others remember the bodies on the dock. They remember Davy freezing to death because Dutch would not walk away. Arthur and Hosea feel the shift first. They have seen Dutch talk his way out of danger, charm sheriffs, outwit rival gangs. Now they have seen him make a call that gets people killed for a dream that never materializes. Arthur buries his doubts under loyalty and habit. Hosea tries to steady Dutch, to remind him of the philosophy that once drew lost soul and idealist alike into the fold. Yet both men know something has cracked. Blackwater sets a pattern that will repeat, Dutch reaches further, the plans grow grander, the deaths more senseless, and the survivors tell themselves it all still means something. If this is what happens when he chases one ferry, what will happen when he sets his sights on an entire city? The answer lies ahead, in Saint Denis, where the dream will meet the bank vaults and boulevards of modern civilization and lose. But before Saint Denis swallows the dream in marble and electric light, the gang takes in a wave of younger blood, the living embodiment of everything Dutch claims to stand for. They are bright, hungry, and idealistic. They believe the speeches. They believe the stories. Lenny Summers is the clearest example. A young black man in a country racing towards segregation and industrial power, he sees Dutch's outfit as both sanctuary and weapon. His father was killed by men in uniforms who never faced justice, a reminder that the world was changing, but not for the better. In Dutch's campfire philosophy, in the talk of freedom and resistance to a corrupt civilization, Lenny hears a way to strike back at the same system that took his family. He reads books, debates politics with Hosea, and argues tactics with Arthur, not because he loves violence, but because he believes there might be meaning in it. To Arthur and John, Lenny is almost a little brother. To Dutch, he is proof that the gang's ideals still attract true believers. When Lenny rides into town, rifle on his back and a plan in his head, he is a story of hope and fury bundled together. He is from its humble beginnings all over again, replayed in a harsher age. Sean Maguire, by contrast, is noise and motion from the very beginning. A young Irish outlaw raised on tales of rebellion, he treats danger as a stage, and Dutch as his favorite audience. Sean's jokes are loud, his boasts louder, but under the bluster sits a ruthless eagerness to impress. If Dutch says charge, Sean is already halfway there, laughing as bullets snap past his head. His humor is a shield, a way to pretend that the noose and the bullet are distant problems, not tomorrow's reality. In the truest sense, Sean is what happens when Dutch's romantic talk of glory finds a listener with no brakes. Then, there is Kieran Duffy, who enters the story in chains. A captured O'Driscoll, blindfolded, terrified, dragged into camp as a bargaining chip in Dutch's private war with Calm. At first, he is nothing more than a name to curse and a body to threaten. Yet over time, Arthur gives him small chances, Hosea offers scraps of kindness, and even the hardest hearts begin to see, not an enemy, but a lost soul searching for any family that will have him. Kieran's loyalty is frantic, desperate. Every chore finished, every risk taken, is a plea not to be cast back into the cold. These younger members look up to Arthur's weary competence, to John's stubborn courage, to Dutch's silver-tongued certainty. They think they are joining a legendary outlaw family, a story that will be told for generations. How could they know they are boarding a sinking ship? The old ways were dying, the Pinkertons were closing in, and this new generation would not grow old in the shadows. For them, the dream will be shorter, bloodier, and far less romantic than the tales that lured them in, and Saint Denis will be where that illusion finally shatters. Saint Denis will shatter the illusion for the gunmen, but in the camp's quieter corners, that illusion has already begun to crack. While the men chase one more score, one more grand speech about freedom and civilization, the women are quietly taking stock, counting bullets and counting exits. Abigail Roberts has been doing that from the very beginning. Once a prostitute passed between outlaws, she claws out a different place for herself as John's partner and Jack's mother, insisting that this so-called family treat her child as more than a mascot. Dutch calls Jack the future. Arthur dotes on him. The gang laughs at his games, yet Abigail hears the gunfire under the lullabies. She respects Dutch's philosophy in theory, but never trusts his promises in practice. When Dutch talks about Tahiti, Abigail talks about school. When he dreams of one last job, she demands that John grow up and walk away. Her arguments, her anger, her pleas in the mud outside Valentine or on the docks of Saint Denis are not just domestic squabbles. They are the living embodiment of the central question of this story. What good is outlaw freedom if it devours a child's chance at a different life? Abigail is not an idealistic revolutionary. She is in the truest sense a survivor, measuring every plan against Jack's safety and already imagining a world beyond the campfires. Tilly Jackson sees that world too. Taken into the gang after running with the Foreman brothers, she understands better than most that a story of loyalty can turn into a story of betrayal overnight. Dutch rescues her, but Tilly never lets that debt become worship. While others hang on his every word, she keeps her own counsel, does her share of cons and robberies, and quietly builds an exit strategy. She talks about Saint Denis not as a target, but as a place to disappear into crowds and find honest work. In a world where the old ways were dying, Tilly is already learning the new ones. Then there is Mary-Beth Gaskill, the gentle con artist with a notebook always close at hand. She distracts Marks with shy smiles, runs simple swindles, and then sits by the fire, writing stories about the people around her. She watches Arthur's doubts, Hosea's weariness, Dutch's fraying edge, recording, reflecting, turning outlaw chaos into something almost literary. From its humble beginnings around those campfires, her habit of observing and writing foreshadows the life she will eventually claim beyond the gunsmoke. Together, these women form a quiet chorus under Dutch's sermons. They talk of leaving, of marriage, of shops and boarding houses and books, long before the men admit the dream is dying. They see that the world was changing, that civilization is not just an enemy, but an inevitability, and they choose to bend rather than break. In a gang racing toward a cliff, some of the only true happy endings will belong to those who step off the wagon early. But who actually makes it out, and what prices do they pay once the shooting stops? Some never step off at all. Some stay on the wagon as it hurtles toward the cliff, and in the middle of that doomed ride, a new passenger climbs aboard with a smile and a smoking gun. Micah Bell arrives late in the story of the Linde gang, but from the very beginning of his tenure he behaves as if the camp already belongs to him. Dutch brings him in not as a drifter to be tested, but as a ready-made enforcer, praising his boldness, his fearlessness, his willingness to spill blood without hesitation. In a world where the old ways were dying and the Pinkertons were closing in, Dutch convinces himself that this is exactly the kind of man he needs. On paper, Micah is just another outlaw. In practice, he is the living embodiment of everything the gang once claimed to stand against. Arthur, slowly waking up to the cost of their freedom, starts to question Dutch's philosophy, to push back against needless cruelty. Hosea, older and quieter, urges caution, compromise, a way out before the dream collapses completely. Micah walks into this fragile balance and kicks it over. Where Arthur sees civilians, Micah sees witnesses. Where Hosea sees a chance to walk away, Micah sees weakness that must be stamped out. The contrast is immediate and brutal. Arthur still robs and kills, but he carries a conscience that grows heavier with every job, a sense that their idealistic talk of helping the poor has rotted into empty slogans. Hosea still lies and steals, yet he tries to keep some line between survival and senseless violence. Micah has no such line. He enjoys chaos in the truest sense, grinning through massacres, baiting lawmen, and turning every setback into an excuse for more blood. When Dutch hesitates, Micah is there, whispering that hesitation is death. Flattery becomes his sharpest weapon. He feeds Dutch's ego, calls him a genius, a prophet, the only man who truly understands that civilization is a cage. Each compliment pushes Dutch one step further from Hosea's counsel and one step closer to the edge. Micah tells him the gang is full of traitors, that Arthur is losing faith, that anyone who questions the plan is already halfway to betrayal. Dutch, already wounded by Blackwater and haunted by failure, listens. The red flags are everywhere. Micah's cruelty toward prisoners, his eagerness to torture information out of them, his habit of turning minor disagreements into camp-wide feuds. All of it signals a story of decay accelerating from within. He needles Bill until Bill resents Arthur. He mocks John's attempts to be a better father. He positions himself as the only man still truly loyal to Dutch, even as he tears Dutch's family apart. Micah Bell is not the cause of Dutch's downfall. The cracks were there from its humble beginnings. But he is the accelerant. He takes Dutch's simmering pride, paranoia, and grand dreams of freedom and turns them into an inferno that will consume the gang before anyone can climb down. And once the fire starts, who can still escape it? The answer, in truth, is that almost no one can. Because while Micah fans the flames from within, the world outside the camp is piling on dry timber and striking its own match. The Pinkertons are not just another rival gang or a faceless posse riding in from the horizon. They are the living embodiment of a new kind of power: corporate law, hired guns and tailored coats, paid by railroads, banks, and industrial barons to make men like Dutch disappear. From the very beginning of 1899, their presence turns the gang's story of rebellion into a manhunt conducted on ledgers, telegrams, and contracts. Agents Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross do not see philosophers or tragic outlaws when they look at the van der Linde gang. They see obsolete criminals in a modernizing nation. Milton's offer to Abigail, his threats to John, his relentless pursuit through Valentine, Rhodes, and Saint Denis are not personal in the truest sense. They are procedural. Dutch calls himself a freedom fighter. Milton calls him a case file. Each confrontation strips away another layer of Dutch's romantic language. On the riverboat in Saint Denis, in the alleys and rooftops after the bank job, the Pinkertons sweep in with precision and paperwork backing every bullet. They are backed by men in offices who never touch a gun, yet control the fate of everyone who does. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's code suddenly looks less like a philosophy and more like a story told to keep frightened people moving. Trains thunder past campfires, telegraph wires hum over empty plains, and cities like Saint Denis loom as monuments to a different world. The gang rides in expecting another frontier town. Instead, they find electric lights, factories, and crowds that swallow them whole. In that city, Arthur and Hosea feel small, almost childish, as if the entire gang has wandered onto the wrong stage in the wrong century. Is this really where men on horseback can win? Dutch refuses to accept that answer. He insists that one last big score will fix everything: a bank in Saint Denis, a trolley station robbery, a Tahitian plantation that exists only in his imagination. Hosea, who once shared every dream, begins to question whether those dreams have rotted into delusions. Arthur, coughing blood and watching Dutch lie more easily with every passing week, feels the gap between belief and reality growing into a canyon. Here the pattern interrupt arrives. Every time the gang reaches for freedom, the world reaches back faster. Every robbery means more Pinkertons. Every dead lawman means harsher orders from railroad offices and government desks. Every sighting of Milton's hat on the horizon is another knot in the rope. By the time the gang digs into Beaver Hollow, the noose is already around its neck. The world was changing, and the camp's days as a wandering family of outlaws are over. Now, each ride out is not a new beginning, but a countdown to the moment when someone fails to ride back at all. From Beaver Hollow onward, the gang lives with a new kind of dread. The Pinkertons are one threat, the law another, but the first true horror that tears through the camp does not arrive with a badge. It arrives with a missing stable boy and a silence that feels wrong from the very beginning. Kieran Duffy had never been the living embodiment of Dutch's grand philosophy. He was an ex-O'Driscoll, a nervous recruit taken in after a botched kidnapping of Arthur, more mascot than soldier in this story of doomed outlaws. Some saw him as a liability, others as proof that even a lost soul from the enemy side could be turned by Dutch's promises of freedom and family. When he vanishes from Beaver Hollow, most assume he has run off or been grabbed in some petty skirmish. Only slowly does the camp realize that Colm O'Driscoll has taken him, and that this is no minor insult. The rescue talk is hesitant, almost embarrassed. Bill and Javier sneer that an ex-O'Driscoll is not worth the risk. Charles and Arthur, hardened but not yet numb, argue that loyalty must mean something or the whole philosophy collapses. Dutch sits above it all, weighing image against danger, treating Kieran's life as one more variable in a long equation of vengeance and survival. In the end, there is no daring raid, no last-minute charge. Days pass. The forest presses in. Kieran simply does not come back. Then his horse does. It stumbles into camp on a gray morning, rider slumped, clothes soaked and stiff. For a heartbeat, some feel relief. Then the truth hits. Kieran's head is gone, his empty neck stuffed with wild flowers, his eyes replaced by a grotesque bouquet, a mocking wreath from the O'Driscolls. Even Arthur, who has seen lynchings, massacres, and the worst of civilization, recoils. The camera of memory lingers, the sway of the corpse, the flies, the stunned silence. The romantic idea of the outlaw life, from its humble beginnings around Dutch's campfire speeches, dies a little in that moment. Reactions fracture the camp. Tilly and Mary-Beth are horrified, clinging to each other as if the world has tilted. Pearson and Uncle stare, shaken but already reaching for routine, because someone still has to cook, someone still has to joke. Some of the gunmen shut down completely, pushing the image away, because feeling it would mean admitting how exposed they have become. And Dutch, in the truest sense, refuses grief. He converts it instantly into fuel. To him, Kieran's mutilation is not a tragedy. It is a message. Dutch storms through camp, roaring that this is what Colm O'Driscoll thinks of them, that mercy is weakness, that there can be no more half measures. A disposable recruit becomes a martyr in Dutch's rhetoric, a reason to double down on a feud that has already cost the gang years of blood. In Dutch's mouth, Kieran's death stops being about a frightened young man and becomes one more brick in the altar of revenge. But beneath the speeches, the lesson is far colder. In this war between gangs and law, between freedom and civilization, there are no minor characters. Every life is expendable, every kindness can be punished, every attempt at escape is met with something worse. If this is what happens to Kieran, the least powerful member of the camp, what price will be demanded from those at its heart? Hosea, Lenny, Arthur? If the flowers in Kieran's neck are only the first warning, what will the final bouquet look like when the noose finally tightens? The flowers in Kieran's neck are only the first warning. The real noose waits in the city. Saint Denis is where the dream rides straight into the teeth of civilization and finally understands what it is up against. From the very beginning, Saint Denis is a shock to the system. Smokestacks belch over the docks, factory whistles slice through the night, and electric lights burn away the darkness that once sheltered outlaw raids. Carriages jam the streets, voices overlap in a dozen languages, and the gang that once ruled empty plains suddenly feels small, out of place, almost ornamental. This is not the open world Dutch promised. This is the living embodiment of everything he claimed to be fighting. At first, Dutch treats the city as another mark, a grander stage for his philosophy. If civilization has stolen freedom, then civilization will pay. But as days turn into weeks, Hosea reads the streets differently. He sees police on every corner, Pinkertons drifting through crowds, the invisible web of money and influence binding every alley. He warns Dutch again and again, this place is too controlled, too watched, too modern. The old ways were dying here long before the gang arrived. The plan for the bank is meant to be their masterpiece. Precision, timing, misdirection, Hosea in the crowd as a distraction, Arthur and Lenny inside, Dutch orchestrating from the shadows. On paper, it is flawless, a story of outlaws outsmarting a corrupt city. In practice, it is a test of whether Dutch can still read the world as it really is, or whether his dreams have curdled into delusions. The answer comes fast. The moment the vault is breached, the mask comes off. Pinkertons pour into the square, rifles raised, orders barked over the screams of bystanders. Smoke, shouting, shattered glass, the careful choreography dissolves in seconds. The gang does not control the tempo here, the city does. Then, the shot that changes everything. Hosea, unarmed, is dragged in front of the bank, held up as an example. Dutch steps toward the window, horrified but helpless, as Agent Milton delivers his speech and his verdict. A single bullet, in broad daylight, in front of the whole world. Hosea Matthews, the conscience of the gang, executed in the street while Dutch watches. In that instant, something essential dies twice. The escape that follows is pure desperation. Smoke bombs, blind corners, frantic sprints through alleys and across iron rooftops. Lenny Summers, clever, idealistic, the closest thing the gang has to a future, darts ahead beside Arthur, laughing in disbelief that they are still alive. Then, rifle fire cracks from the darkness. Lenny falls without a last word, his body swallowed by the city below, abandoned because there is no time. Two of the gang's best, gone in a single night. If Saint Denis is the city that kills the dream, this rooftop flight is where Dutch's family stops being a family and becomes a list of names waiting for their turn. And the noose, once distant, is now firmly around the gang's throat. The next camp, the next scheme, will only pull it tighter. For a moment, the noose around the gang's throat is forgotten in a burst of laughter and spilled whiskey. Before St. Denis turns into a killing ground, the story of Lenny Summers is a story of possibility. Around the campfire and in the saloon, he and Arthur share rare nights where the outlaw life feels almost bearable, where the world seems wide open instead of closing in. From its humble beginnings, That bond is built on more than gunfights. Lenny is young, sharp, and already disillusioned with civilization's promises. In Valentine, drunk and grinning, he and Arthur stagger through the mud, calling each other's names, losing and finding one another in a blur of lantern light and piano music. It is absurd, almost ironic. Two wanted men, barely able to stand, somehow safer in a crowded bar than they will ever be in Dutch's grand designs. In those moments, Lenny talks about the future, about a world where a black man might be treated as a man in the truest sense, not as property, not as a target. That hope follows him to Saint Denis. Lenny reads, he thinks, he listens. He is drawn to Dutch's philosophy, but not blind to its cracks. Around the docks and alleys of the city, he wonders aloud whether dreams of freedom can survive in a place built on banks and factories. The world was changing. The old ways were dying, and Lenny wants to live long enough to see what comes next, to step beyond the gang without abandoning the family that gave him shelter. Instead, that future ends on the rooftops. When the bank job collapses, when Hosea falls and the plan dissolves into smoke, Lenny runs beside Arthur through choking gunpowder and ringing church bells. They vault chimneys, duck behind skylights, firing back at faceless lawmen whose uniforms blur in the haze. It is chaos, but it is also familiar, two guns against the world, holding the line for a few more desperate seconds. Then the line snaps. As Lenny climbs, exposed against the skyline, a volley of shots tears into him. Once, twice, again his body jerks, then tumbles backwards, rolling across the tiles, eyes already empty before he comes to rest. Arthur reaches for him, but more rifles rise, more shouts echo from the alleys below. To stay is death or a cell. To move is to abandon a friend. He moves. Lenny's loss strikes Arthur differently than Hosea's. This is not an old man who chose this road from the very beginning, but a young outlaw, whose potential is spent on a doomed spectacle. A bright mind, a loyal heart, used as another piece in Dutch's unraveling game. Dutch barely looks back. One more name, one more sacrifice, folded into a new speech about one last score, one last escape. In Lenny's blood on the tiles, Dutch's family becomes a ledger, and every lost soul is written off as the cost of his fading dream. And still, he keeps planning. Who will be next on that ledger? That question is answered on a beach. Not in Saint Denis, not in a grand city bank, but on a nameless shore where the gang washes up broken, sunburned, and half-drowned. A story of grand dreams reduced to wreckage in the surf. After the Saint Denis disaster, the Linde gang is scattered to the wind. Hosea and Lenny are dead, John is captured, Abigail is missing, and the Pinkertons are closing in. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and a handful of survivors are thrown onto Guarma, a distant island far from home, far from resources, far from any hope of an easy escape. From its humble beginnings in snowy Coulter, the gang's world has shrunk to a strip of sand and a foreign war they never meant to join. Guarma is supposed to be a detour. It becomes an X-ray. Under the white sun and the sugarcane, Dutch's philosophy is stripped to the bone. Surrounded by revolutionaries, cruel overseers, and a brutal colonial regime, Dutch finds exactly the kind of injustice he always claimed to hate. Yet his response is not measured resistance or careful strategy. It is paranoia, violence, and improvisation on the edge of madness. He throws in with the local rebels, then abandons them the moment their suffering no longer serves his plan. He orders executions, burns fields, and escalates the conflict with a reckless zeal that feels less like liberation and more like indulgence. Every atrocity is justified as survival, as a step toward freedom, as proof that the dream still lives. In the truest sense, Guarma turns Dutch's rhetoric into a mirror, and what stares back is not an idealistic outlaw leader, but a man who cannot accept that the world was changing without him. Arthur watches it all. He sees Dutch leave allies to die, ignore pleas for mercy, and gamble lives on promises that grow emptier by the day. Once, Dutch's speeches felt like scripture. On Guarma, they sound rehearsed, desperate, almost hollow. The man who once rescued lost soul after lost soul now treats Charles, Javier, and Arthur as expendable pieces on a board only he can see. Is this still strategy, or just ego refusing to admit defeat? The island becomes a pressure cooker, boiling away the romantic veneer that had covered the gang from the very beginning. Dutch is willing to sacrifice rebels, servants, even his own men, if it buys him one more chance at escape, one more chance to prove he was right. Freedom, family, philosophy, all the words he loved become bargaining chips in a private war against reality. When the survivors finally claw their way back to the mainland, nothing has truly been left behind. Guarma follows them home. Arthur's faith is cracked, Dutch's mask is slipping, and the gang's return is not a reset, but a countdown. The old ways were dying, and now, for the Van der Linde gang, their final collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a certainty, waiting in the trees at Beaver Hollow. The countdown begins not with a gunfight, but with a cough. After Guarma, as the gang staggers through its illusion of a fresh start, the moment that seals Arthur Morgan's fate is not grand or heroic. It is ugly, intimate, and entirely in line with Dutch's philosophy turned rotten. It goes back to Thomas Downes. From the very beginning of the game, Dutch sends Arthur to collect on a debt from a desperate rancher already coughing his lungs out. Arthur does what the enforcer of the Van der Linde gang is supposed to do. He beats a sick man into the mud for a few dollars, for the dream of one more score, for the promise that this outlaw family can still outrun civilization. Downes's blood spatters Arthur's face. His cough fills Arthur's lungs. In the truest sense, Arthur's death sentence is carried out in that moment, on Dutch's orders and with Arthur's own hands. For a long time, nothing seems to change. Then the cough returns. It grows from an annoyance into a violence all its own, dropping Arthur to his knees in the streets of Saint Denis, turning a routine errand into a collapse in the dust. The doctor's verdict is swift and merciless: tuberculosis, advanced, incurable. In a world where the old ways were dying, Arthur discovers that his body is dying too. From there, his decline mirrors the gang's unraveling. Coughing fits interrupt robberies. His aim wavers. His vision swims with brief, disorienting flashes, half-hallucinations of wolves and storms, of Dutch's rhetoric echoing against the reality of starving children and burned farms. The living embodiment of Dutch's muscle is becoming too weak to lift his own saddle, and with that weakness comes something Dutch cannot control. Time to think. Illness slows Arthur down, and in the spaces between gunshots and heists, reflection seeps in. What is all this loyalty really bought? Freedom, or just a different cage? He revisits his own brutality, from Downes to the O'Driscolls, and wonders how many lives were broken in service of one man's failing philosophy. The story of Arthur Morgan shifts here, from its humble beginnings as Dutch's favorite enforcer into the tale of a man who knows he is dying, and must decide what kind of outlaw he wants to be at the end. Key encounters sharpen that decision. Sister Caldern, meeting Arthur on a bench in Saint Denis, refuses to condemn him as a monster. She speaks of faith, forgiveness, and the simple act of doing one good thing when the world seems lost. Rains Fall, calm and dignified as his people are driven toward extinction, shows Arthur a different model of strength, patience, mercy, and acceptance in the face of inevitable loss. Their words cut through Dutch's grand speeches. They ask, without asking directly, who Arthur truly serves. These conversations turn his sickness into a mirror. He cannot save the gang from its own delusions or Dutch from his betrayals. But perhaps he can save John, Abigail, Jack. Perhaps he can pull a few lost souls away from the edge before the final collapse at Beaver Hollow. From this point on, every cough is a reminder. Every job is a choice. The clock is ticking, and Arthur Morgan's remaining days become not a race for treasure, but a race for redemption. Arthur's race for redemption runs parallel to another. Quieter struggle, John Marston's attempt to simply walk away. If Arthur is the living embodiment of Dutch's dream-turned conscience, John becomes the test of whether that dream can ever truly let anyone go. From the very beginning of 1899, John's place in the gang is already strained. He vanishes in the blizzard after Blackwater, returning half-frozen and mauled by wolves. And Dutch's reaction is telling. Instead of concern, there is suspicion. Instead of welcome, there is a lecture about loyalty. John hears the message clearly. In this family, a man can be left for dead if the plan requires it. Each camp that follows only widens the distance. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, John is thrown into the most dangerous work, yet still treated as unreliable. A hothead, a problem to be managed. Dutch uses him when needed, then dismisses his doubts as selfishness. When John questions the wisdom of Saint Denis, or the endless alliances with men like Angelo Bronte, Dutch frames it as weakness. Real men, Dutch insists, believe, real family does not ask so many questions. Abigail does. Abigail sees the story for what it is becoming. To her, this is no longer a band of misfits chasing freedom on the edges of civilization. It is a death cult orbiting one man's ego. She pressures John again and again to think of Jack first. She reminds him that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that Dutch's philosophy will not keep their son from a noose or a bullet. Around the campfire, her words sound almost treasonous. In the truest sense, they are the only sane ones. John tries to leave. He slips away from the gang between chapters, hoping to carve a life beyond wanted posters and Pinkerton files. To Dutch, this is betrayal. To Arthur, at least at first, it is cowardice. Arthur has built his entire identity on standing by Dutch. Seeing John walk away feels like a personal insult, proof that the younger son is abandoning the father they both owe everything to. That resentment simmers. Jabs are traded, tempers flare, and John's absence during key disasters becomes one more wound in Arthur's pride. Yet as Dutch grows more erratic at Shady Belle and finally Beaver Hollow, as Micah's whispers replace Hosea's counsel, John's earlier skepticism starts to look less like weakness and more like instinct for survival. Who is truly betraying whom? By the time Dutch leaves John pinned under gunfire in the chaos of Saint Denis, the mask is gone. John understands that to Dutch, he is expendable, a tool, a story already written off. Arthur, now dying and newly clear-eyed, reverses his judgment and risks everything to bring John back, knowing that saving this one man, this one family, may be the only real victory left. John will live. He will build Beecher's hope, raise Jack, bury Abigail. Yet Dutch's shadow, and the government that watched the gang crumble, will follow him to that lonely ranch. Because when the Pinkertons let one outlaw walk away, what are they really planning next? John will live. But survival is not the same as being saved, and the cost of Dutch's dream falls hardest on those who loved him most. If Arthur and John show the shattering of Dutch's philosophy, Molly O'Shea and Susan Grimshaw show the collapse of his heart, his home, his so-called family. From the very beginning, Molly is framed as Dutch's lover, draped in fine dresses and bright optimism, the actress who believes she has finally found a leading man worthy of her devotion. She is not a planner, not a gun hand, not a strategist. She is the woman Dutch promises the world to, then quietly forgets as the world was changing around him. As the gang sinks from its humble beginnings into paranoia and hunger, Dutch's attention drifts toward Micah's flattery and grand schemes. Molly, once the center of his gaze, becomes an afterthought at the edge of the fire. That neglect festers. In camp conversations, Molly's cheer turns to bitterness, her jokes to barbs. She drinks more. She snaps at others. She watches Dutch risk everyone for abstract dreams of Tahiti, while he will not even look her in the eye. In the truest sense, she becomes the living embodiment of what Dutch does to those who give him their loyalty. He uses their adoration as proof of his greatness, then abandons them the moment they demand something real. The breaking point comes at Beaver Hollow. Drunk, desperate, mascara streaked by tears and rain, Molly staggers into the center of camp and detonates the illusion. She screams that she told the Pinkertons about the Saint Denis bank job, that she betrayed Dutch because he would not listen, because he would not love her. It is one of the ugliest scenes in the story, not because of gunfire, but because every word is a wound. What follows is even uglier. Before Dutch can process what she is saying, before anyone can question her, Susan Grimshaw steps forward, pistol drawn. Susan, the camp's iron spine, the woman who has enforced Dutch's rules for years, does not hesitate. She declares Molly a traitor and shoots her in the gut, executing her in front of everyone as Dutch stands frozen, saying almost nothing. The man who preached about freedom and justice cannot even hold his lover's hand as she dies. And here the ambiguity cuts deepest. Did Molly actually speak to the Pinkertons, or was she just trying to hurt Dutch in the only way left to her? The game never confirms it. But in the end, it hardly matters. Dutch does not defend her. He does not demand proof. He lets Susan pull the trigger, then retreats into Micah's poisonous orbit, muttering that Molly never did betray them, as if that absolves his cowardice. Susan's own fate completes the collapse. During the final shootout in Beaver Hollow, when the gang finally turns on itself, Susan tries one last time to enforce order, to drag Bill and Javier back into line. Micah answers with a bullet, killing the woman who once kept Dutch honest. With Molly and Susan dead, the camp loses not only its matriarchs, but its last illusion of internal justice. Dutch's family, in that moment, is revealed as nothing more than frightened outlaws following a hollow prophet. Two women who believed in him. Two women he could not protect, could not comfort, could not even properly mourn. Their deaths are not just tragedies, they are a verdict. If Dutch cannot love Molly, cannot stand by Susan, what is left of the man who promised to save every lost soul he found on the road? And as those gunshots fade in Beaver Hollow, another question rises from the smoke. If this is what happens to Dutch's closest believers, what future can there be for the men who still cling to him? For some, that future is a grave on a lonely hill. For others, it is something worse, survival in service of the wrong man. If Susan and Molly show what happens when Dutch discards his closest believers, then Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela show what happens to the ones who refuse to let go. From the very beginning, Bill is a bundle of nerves wrapped in a soldier's coat. A former army man with a dishonorable discharge, he is haunted by failure, desperate to prove he is not the coward the world once decided he was. Dutch's praise becomes his medal, his rank, his entire sense of worth. So when Dutch shouts, Bill charges. When Dutch needs muscle, Bill is the first through the door, his temper flaring at any hint of disrespect, his insecurity boiling over into violence. He is loyalty, weaponized by fear. Javier, by contrast, is the romantic. A revolutionary fugitive from Mexico, scarred by civil conflict and betrayal, he arrives in the gang already carrying a philosophy of resistance. Dutch's speeches about freedom, about civilization crushing the weak, sound to him like a righteous echo of old battles. In the truest sense, Javier does not just follow Dutch, he believes in him. Around the campfire, with a guitar in his hands and stories of the old country on his tongue, Javier becomes the living embodiment of the gang's idealistic self-image, outlaws as freedom fighters, criminals as persecuted heroes. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. As Hosea's doubts grow, as Arthur starts to question the blood on their hands, Bill and Javier move in the opposite direction. Every failed job, every corpse in the mud, only makes them cling tighter to Dutch's mythology. When Arthur and John begin to challenge Dutch's decisions, Bill hears only insubordination. Javier hears only betrayal. The arrival of Micah Bell turns that tension into a fault line. Micah flatters Dutch's ego and feeds his paranoia, and Bill and Javier drift to that new center of gravity. They stand guard outside secret meetings, echo Dutch's accusations that Arthur has lost faith, that John has gone soft. In Beaver Hollow, when the gang splits between Dutch and Micah on one side and Arthur and John on the other, Bill and Javier choose their general, not their brothers. Loyalty to the leader wins out over loyalty to the truth. That choice carries them to Mount Hagen. As Arthur and Micah's feud reaches its frozen crescendo, Bill and Javier are there as Dutch's last remaining soldiers, rifles in hand, caught in a battle they no longer understand but refuse to abandon. When the gunsmoke clears and Dutch walks away into the blizzard, Bill and Javier do the same, slipping down the mountain and out of Arthur's story. Their escape is not freedom, it is a sentence. In time, those footsteps in the snow lead to Fort Mercer and the Mexican border, where the United States government will unleash John Marston as their hound. One man will die behind stone walls in a foreign revolution, the other will be dragged back in chains to the very civilization he once swore to fight. But that part of the story is still waiting on the horizon. But while John is dragged back toward the very civilization he once tried to outrun, another survivor moves in the opposite direction. Charles Smith does not roar or grandstand. He endures. His story is quieter, but in its own way it is a story of resistance against a world determined to erase him. From the very beginning, Charles stands apart from the gang's louder egos. Born to a native mother and an African father, shuttled between reservations, cities, and prize-fighting rings, he grows up belonging nowhere. That mixed heritage, that lifetime of displacement, carves a man who understands how the world was changing long before Dutch does. He hunts with a patience the others lack, fights with a brutal efficiency, and carries a code that is not Dutch's philosophy, but something older and harder. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of survival, on a frontier that has already decided who should disappear. At camp, Charles becomes a stabilizing force. When others argue over shares and schemes, he is the one hauling meat, guarding the perimeter, checking on the sick. He shields Kieran from cruelty, comforts Jack when the boy is taken and returned, and pushes Arthur toward mercy when vengeance would be simpler. Who insists on freeing the horses in the burning Braithwaite Manor, risking his life for animals no one will remember? Charles, who helps Arthur bury the dead, rather than leaving them for crows. Again, Charles, in a gang drawn to chaos, he quietly chooses compassion, over and over. As Dutch's plans grow wilder and the old ways were dying, Charles's loyalty shifts from the man to the people suffering under him. During the Saint Denis disaster and the flight to Guarma, he is indispensable, scouting, hunting, patching wounds. Later, at Beaver Hollow, when Arthur and John finally begin to oppose Dutch, Charles does not hesitate. He helps Arthur rescue John from Sisika, covers their escape through the swamps, and stands against Colm O'Driscoll's remnants and the Pinkertons with the same calm ferocity. When the gang collapses on that mountain, he is there, not preaching about freedom, but buying time with his own blood. Remarkably, he survives. Years later, in the epilogue, Charles resurfaces in Saint Denis, battered from underground prizefights, still hounded as an outlaw in a city that pretends to be civilized. John finds him, and once more Charles chooses family over flight. He rides to Beecher's Hope, helps build the ranch board by board, and joins John and Sadie in finishing unfinished business with Micah on Mount Hagen, closing the last open wound from its humble beginnings. After that, he does what almost no one from the Van der Linde gang manages to do. He leaves. With money in his pocket and Pinkertons still sniffing around, Charles speaks of heading north across the border into Canada, where U.S. law holds less sway and his past is only a rumor. Does he make it? The game never says, but in a world that devours outlaws, the implication is clear. Charles Smith finally slips the noose and walks toward a life beyond violence, one lost soul who truly breaks the cycle. And he is not the only one who tries. Sadie Adler is the proof that not every escape from the Van der Linde gang leads toward peace. For her, freedom does not mean a quiet farm or a new name. It means a revolver, a bounty poster, and a trail of dead men stretching across a dying frontier. From the very beginning, Sadie's story is a story of loss. She is introduced not as an outlaw, but as a grieving widow in a burned-out cabin, her husband Jake hanging from the rafters, murdered by the O'Driscolls as the world outside marches towards civilization. Dutch's gang rescues her, brings her to camp, gives her a blanket and a bowl of stew. But what they truly give her is something far more dangerous, a purpose when she has nothing left to lose. At first, she is shell-shocked, feral, barely speaking, clinging to Jake's memory and the ruins of a life that ended in a single morning. Yet the old ways were dying, and with them died any illusion that a woman on the edge of this world could remain sheltered. Sadie watches, listens, and learns. She trades grief for fury, fear for precision, and slowly she becomes the living embodiment of what happens when pain is sharpened into a weapon. Her evolution is brutal and unmistakable. By the time the gang reaches Clemens Point and Shady Bell, Sadie is demanding to ride on jobs, to shoot, to take revenge on the O'Driscolls who shattered her family. She cuts her hair, sheds the dresses that marked her as a rancher's wife, and steps into gun belts in the truest sense, embracing violence not only as vengeance, but as a new identity. When she and Arthur storm the O'Driscoll camp to rescue Colm's captive, there is no trace of the trembling widow. There is only the hunter. That transformation forges fierce loyalty. As Dutch's philosophy curdles and the gang fractures between delusions and survival, Sadie chooses her side without hesitation. She rides with Arthur into Saint Denis to save John from the prison convoy, defies Dutch's orders, and later stands with Arthur and John against Micah's poison at Beaver Hollow. In a family built on loyalty and betrayal, she is one of the few who never wavers. After the collapse, Sadie refuses to disappear into some polite corner of civilization. She becomes a bounty hunter, roaming from Blackwater to the mountains, taking contracts on rustlers, killers, anyone with a price on their head. It is dangerous independence, earned with blood and gun smoke. She helps John rescue Abigail, helps him confront Micah on that final frozen mountain, and walks away alive when so many others do not. Then, almost without ceremony, she vanishes. In the epilogue, she speaks of heading to South America, chasing new work, new horizons, one more frontier that has not yet been tamed. She rides off, and the story lets her go. No grave, no newspaper clipping, no final showdown. Just absence. Did she die in some jungle ambush? Did she build a new legend far from the Pinkertons' reach? Rockstar never says, and that silence turns her into one more lost soul, drifting through the gang's long shadow. And if Sadie Adler's fate is a mystery, what does that say about the man who led her into this life in the first place? That question leads straight to the man who proved that Dutch's philosophy was never just about freedom. It was also about pride. And nothing wounded that pride more than Leviticus Cornwall. From the very beginning, Cornwall is not presented as a rival outlaw or a colorful gunslinger. He is a ruthless industrialist, a rail and oil magnate whose name sits on train cars, refinery gates, and ledgers across the region. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of the new American order, capital, concrete, and corporate law replacing horses, handshake deals, and campfire promises. Where Dutch sees the world as a story of noble bandits resisting corrupt civilization, Cornwall sees only assets, liabilities, and problems to be erased. At first, the gang treats him as just another faceless rich man to rob. A train here, a payroll there, a shipment of bonds snatched in the snow. From its humble beginnings, this feud is practical, almost impersonal. Dutch targets Cornwall because the man is rich, because his trains are fat, because the gang needs money. But with every robbery, something shifts. Dutch starts talking about Cornwall not as a victim, but as an enemy, a symbol, proof that the world was changing and that his way of life is under siege. Cornwall responds in a way that no rancher or small-town banker ever could. He does not challenge Dutch to a duel. He does not send a posse. He hires the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and turns a regional nuisance into a national priority. Milton and Ross do not just chase the gang across a county. They drag federal authority, private capital, and industrial surveillance into the wilderness. Suddenly, this is no longer a local story of outlaws and sheriffs. It is a collision between a fading frontier and organized corporate power. The more Dutch hits Cornwall's holdings, the more personal it becomes, on both sides. Cornwall arrives in Valentine, then in St. Denis, not as a distant name on a ledger, but as a man willing to burn lives and money to make an example. He wants Dutch ruined publicly, as a warning to anyone who still believes the old ways were dying slowly instead of being executed. Dutch, stung and cornered, convinces himself that striking back will restore control. So when Dutch guns Cornwall down on the docks of St. Denis, it should feel like a victory. The gang has killed the man who bankrolled their tormentors. Yet the moment Cornwall falls, the truth is obvious. Nothing stops. No trains halt. No refineries close. No Pinkertons turn around. If anything, the pressure intensifies. Killing Cornwall is not an escape, it is a point of no return. Cornwall was only one man. The system he represented does not bleed out beside him. It keeps moving, faceless and relentless, while the gang is hunted toward extinction. And as Dutch slips deeper into delusions of grand last scores and foreign escapes, another question rises. When the enemy is not a man, but a world, how does an outlaw family even pretend to fight back? The answer, in the end, is that an outlaw family cannot fight a whole world. It can only run from it, until there is nowhere left to go. After St. Denis and the blood on the cobblestones, the Van der Linde gang reaches that point. Beaver Hollow is not a camp so much as a grave. Hidden in a fetid corner of the Roanoke Ridge woods, choked by swamp mist and rotting leaves, it is the living embodiment of what the gang has become. From its humble beginnings around warm fires and open skies, the group now huddles in a dark cave. Surrounded by disease, starvation, and the constant buzz of insects. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the place Dutch chooses reflects that truth better than any speech ever could. Here, the fractures that once ran quietly beneath the surface split wide open. On one side, Arthur, Charles, and Sadie cling to a fading idea of loyalty, trying to protect the weak and keep some remnant of the gang's original philosophy alive. On the other, Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier harden into a paranoid block, convinced that brutality and blind obedience are the only paths to survival. Men and women who once sang around the fire now hover in the middle, afraid to pick a side, afraid not to. What happens to a family when every choice feels like betrayal? Dutch himself becomes a ghost in his own story. He disappears for long stretches, riding off without explanation, returning with wild eyes and half-formed schemes about Tahiti, about one last score, about Micah's mysterious information. Hungry children and sick camp members beg for food, for medicine, for direction, and he walks past them as if they are strangers. The man who once quoted books and promised freedom now hangs on Micah's every word, dismissing Arthur and Charles as pessimists, treating concern as treason. Under the constant threat of Pinkertons, Beaver Hollow turns into a pressure cooker. Every snapped twig in the woods sounds like a raid. Every unknown rider could be an informant. Kieran's grisly fate has already shown what happens to those suspected of talking, and that memory lingers over every whispered conversation. Laughter dies out. Card games feel forced. Even shared meals become silent, suspicious rituals, as if poison might be hidden in the stew. Fear replaces camaraderie. Paranoia replaces trust. A story of freedom, family, and resistance decays into one of surveillance, accusations, and quiet terror. Arthur's patience, worn thin by illness and disillusionment, finally breaks. John's attempts to leave and protect Abigail and Jack are met with contempt, then open hostility. In the truest sense, Dutch now sees questions as bullets aimed at his authority, and he is ready to shoot back. The next move will not be a robbery or a rescue. It will be a reckoning, and this time the enemy is sitting around the same fire. That reckoning takes shape in the mud long before it reaches the mountains. It begins not with a gunshot, but with a stare across the campfire, Arthur Morgan on one side, Micah Bell on the other, and Dutch van der Linde caught between them. A story of loyalty and betrayal is about to turn inward, and the gang's greatest threat is no longer the Pinkertons or civilization, but its own reflection. From the very beginning of Micah's time with the gang, Arthur senses something rotten. After Strawberry, when Micah slaughters O'Driscolls and civilians with equal enthusiasm, Arthur calls out the needless cruelty. The way Micah treats murder as sport rather than survival. Dutch waves it off as the price of freedom. When Micah pushes for the Valentine Bank, for the St. Denis escalation, for the bloody stand at Beaver Hollow, Arthur questions the philosophy behind it, only to be dismissed as tired, sentimental, or weak. Micah understands Dutch's fears in a way that is almost surgical. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch is terrified of becoming irrelevant. Micah feeds that terror, whispering that Arthur and John have gone soft, that they want to steal the gang, that Hosea's doubts got him killed. Every setback becomes proof of betrayal rather than bad planning. Where Arthur once reinforced Dutch's conscience, Micah now reinforces his paranoia, turning Dutch's dream into a mirror that only reflects enemies. As Arthur's illness worsens, his role shifts. He is no longer just Dutch's enforcer, he becomes, in the truest sense, a whistleblower within an outlaw family. He warns John to run, he backs Sadie's instincts, he questions every half-baked scheme Micah proposes. When he discovers that Micah has been speaking with Agent Milton, when the possibility that Micah is the informant hardens into near certainty. Arthur risks everything to confront Dutch, even knowing that Dutch has already begun to see him as a traitor. That confrontation at Beaver Hollow is the living embodiment of the gang's collapse. Arthur accuses Micah of being the rat. Micah snarls back that Arthur is the one who has turned, pointing to Arthur's concern for John, for Abigail, for Jack, as if love itself were betrayal. Dutch listens, but he does not hear. He looks at Arthur, the son from its humble beginnings, and at Micah, the ruthless survivor promising one last score, and he hesitates. The camp splits along that hesitation. Charles, Sadie, and the few who still believe in some shred of the old philosophy lean toward Arthur. Bill, Javier, and the more fearful, those who cannot imagine life beyond Dutch's shadow, drift toward Micah. Every argument over food, over money, over risk becomes a referendum, Arthur's fading idealism or Micah's naked brutality. Which future promises survival, and which promises a grave with a sermon about dreams and delusions? In the end, the mud itself becomes a moral line. Arthur and Micah are no longer simply arguing over plans, they are fighting over Dutch's soul, over what the van der Linde name will mean in its final chapter. Only one of them can walk away from that war of ideals and survival. The question is not who draws first. The question is, who does Dutch choose to turn his back on when the gun smoke clears? When Dutch turns his back in that mud-choked clearing, the choice that truly matters has already been made. Not Dutch's, Arthur's. The loyal enforcer who once would have died to protect the gang's money decides, at the very end, that the money is the least important thing in the world. On that final ride up the mountain, with the Pinkertons closing in and the gang shattered, Arthur chooses John. He sends the last surviving son of the van der Linde dream away from the chaos, away from Micah, away from Dutch's delusions. The man who spent his life enforcing another man's philosophy finally breaks the cycle by insisting on someone else's freedom. It is, in the truest sense, an act of rebellion against everything he helped build. The game presents branching paths in this climax, but they are branches on the same dying tree. Whether Arthur turns back for the money or keeps pushing John toward safety, whether he fights Micah in the dust or crawls toward one last stand, the destination does not change. The tuberculosis that has been eating him from the inside since the very beginning claims him in 1899 on that exposed mountaintop, with the world changing beneath his boots and the old ways were dying all around him. In the high honor ending, the story of Arthur Morgan closes with a kind of hard-won grace. He helps John escape, refuses to chase the money, and drags himself up the ridge to face Micah one last time. Dutch arrives, torn between his two remaining disciples, and in that moment Arthur finally names what Micah really is: betrayal made flesh. Dutch walks away, his family in ruins, leaving Arthur bleeding and broken. As the sun rises, Arthur looks out over a world he knows he will never see again, and there is something approaching peace on his face. He has failed in so many ways, but in his last days he tried to undo the damage he helped cause. Is that enough for redemption? The low honor version strips away that fragile serenity. Arthur claws for the money, is beaten down in the dirt, and dies staring up at a stormy sky, his last moments defined by rage and bitterness rather than acceptance. Yet, even here, the core remains the same. No bullet kills him. No outlaw triumphs over him. The illness does. The mountaintop is still his grave. Arthur's fate is the emotional climax of this saga, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a lost soul who becomes the living embodiment of the gang's contradictions. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde family promised freedom and found only graves. Arthur's death fixes the timeline in place, and everything that follows, from John's homestead to Dutch's final fall, grows out of that lonely sunrise in 1899. Arthur's sunrise leaves one man unaccounted for. Dutch rides away from that mountaintop in 1899, not as a leader, not as a father, but as a hollowed-out prophet whose own philosophy has finally devoured him. The gang is gone. His dreams are ash. But Dutch van der Linde's story is not finished. In his last moments with Arthur, Dutch makes his choice. He listens as Arthur begs him to see Micah for what he is, to remember the very beginning, to remember Hosea, to remember the family they were supposed to be. For a heartbeat, the mask slips. Then Dutch turns, walks away, and leaves Arthur to die while Micah slithers back down the mountain with the money. It is a betrayal in the truest sense, not just of a man, but of an entire philosophy of freedom and loyalty. Years later, on that same frozen spine of Mount Hagen, Dutch returns. He has been a ghost for the whole epilogue, an absence more powerful than a presence, until John tracks Micah to his snowbound fortress. The standoff is simple: John, Sadie, Micah, guns drawn in the thin air. Then Dutch steps from the cabin, older, quieter, his eyes sunken and unreadable, two former sons and the traitor who replaced them, all in one room. What does a man do when his delusions finally collide? Dutch raises his gun and shoots Micah in the chest. No warning, no speech, just a single, decisive act. Players have argued ever since, is it guilt, finally acknowledged? Cold self-preservation, removing the last witness to Blackwater and Arthur's death? Or one last, muddled attempt at justice from a man who can no longer tell where justice ends and ego begins? Dutch gives no answer. He lets John take the money, stares out into the snow, and walks away without a word, the living embodiment of a lost soul who has outlived his own legend. From there, Dutch disappears into rumor. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the era of the great roaming outlaw family is over. When he resurfaces years later in 1911, it is not with a caravan of wagons and an idealistic speech, but at the head of a smaller, more radical band of native and Mexican outlaws in the mountains near Mexico. His rhetoric has hardened, his war is now openly against civilization itself. He kidnaps, raids, and bombs, turning his once romantic rebellion into open terrorism. Hunted by John and the U.S. government, Dutch makes his final stand on another cliff edge. Surrounded, with nowhere left to run, he talks about cycles of violence, about progress grinding people into dust, about a world that no longer has room for men like him. Then he steps backward into the void rather than be captured, choosing the fall over the cage. It is the end of an era, a man who dreamed of freedom reduced to a fugitive, who cannot live in the world he helped create. But Dutch's death is not the end of this story. His shadow is about to fall on the last survivors of his so-called family. Dutch's fall leaves a vacuum, and into that vacuum steps the one man who never believed in the gang's ideals at all. If Dutch was the dreamer, Micah Bell was the carrion bird circling the dream, waiting for it to die. From the very beginning, the game plants the seeds of Micah's betrayal. Pinkerton agent Milton taunts Arthur with knowledge only an insider could provide, arriving at camp again and again with uncanny timing. The St. Denis Bank, the raid on Clemens Point, the ambush at Beaver Hollow, these are not random encounters with law and civilization. They are the living embodiment of inside information being weaponized. In the epilogue, Edgar Ross confirms it outright. Micah had been talking, trading secrets for survival while preaching loyalty around the fire. This is not just a theory whispered by angry outlaws. It is spelled out in dialogue, in Milton's smug confidence, in Dutch's sudden awareness that someone has been feeding the enemy. When Arthur confronts Micah on the mountain in 1899, the argument is not merely about money or Dutch's philosophy. It is about who sold the gang out, who turned a story of freedom and family into a trail of setups and shallow graves. After the gang shatters, Micah does not ride into obscurity. He rides higher. By the time John tracks him down years later, Micah is holed up on Mount Hagen with a new crew of cutthroats, clinging to the Blackwater money and the last scraps of his power. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Micah's answer is not reinvention or remorse. It is to freeze himself in place atop a mountain, surrounded by guns and snow, pretending the storm below cannot touch him. The assault on that fortress is a story of unfinished business. John, Charles, and Sadie carved their way up the slopes, fighting through Micah's men in blizzards and rock-choked passes, every step a reckoning for someone left in the dirt. Then, in the cabin at the summit, the past walks in. Dutch is there, silent, watching the two survivors of his family aim guns at each other. What follows is a standoff built on years of lies and delusions. Micah pleads, accuses, twists the truth. John demands justice. Dutch weighs his own guilt. The shot that ends it can come from Dutch or John, but the result is fixed. Micah Bell dies on that mountain, because Red Dead Redemption requires it. John's later history, his legend as the man who outlived Dutch and his traitor, depends on this corpse in the snow. In the truest sense, Micah's end is the moral of his own story. Betrayal buys time, not safety. The informant who once walked freely into Pinkerton camps dies trapped in his own, proving that every rat eventually runs out of places to hide. But Micah is not the only survivor to face a reckoning. Others from the gang choose very different paths into the new century. Not every survivor rides into a blizzard of bullets or vanishes into the mountains. Some simply drift away from the fire while it is still burning, and somehow endure. Among the van der Linde misfits, no one embodies that quiet escape more than Uncle and Leopold Strauss's old butcher, Simon Pearson. From the very beginning, Uncle is the camp's running joke. A shameless drunk, a self-proclaimed connoisseur of old injuries, he spends more time napping against kegs than guarding the perimeter. Yet beneath the laziness and tall tales, he watches. He listens. He is the living embodiment of the gang's self-awareness, forever poking at Dutch's grand philosophy. Forever reminding Arthur and John that for all the speeches about freedom and civilization, someone still has to chop wood and stoke the fire. When the gang finally fractures, Uncle does not die for an idealistic dream or charge a line of Pinkertons. He simply slips out of Dutch's orbit. The world was changing, the old ways were dying. And a man who never truly believed in the sermons has little reason to follow the preacher into the abyss. For a time his trail goes cold, as if the camp's clown has wandered off stage for good. Then, years later, he reappears at Beecher's Hope, shuffling into John Marston's half-built ranch with that same lazy swagger. On paper, he is the last man any ranch needs. In practice, he becomes essential. He helps break horses, wrangle cattle, and, just as crucially, puncture John's growing obsession with proving himself a respectable man. Their bickering is more than comic relief. It is a story of a broken outlaw family trying to pass for ordinary in a world that no longer wants their kind. Pearson takes an even quieter road. After the bitter move to Beaver Hollow, he chooses survival over loyalty and walks away, his departure marked not by gunfire but by a weary farewell. Later, in Rhodes, he resurfaces behind a butcher's counter and general store window, white apron on, ledger in hand. The former camp cook who once scraped together meals in the mud now sells neat cuts of meat to townsfolk. His walls decorated with photographs of the old gang. Respectable, rooted, almost content. Is there a sharper contrast to Dutch's doomed crusade than this plump shopkeeper who simply learned to live under civilization's rules? In the truest sense, both men outlive legends like Arthur and Hosea precisely because they step away. They trade grand causes for small routines, and those small routines save them, but even comic relief cannot outrun the tide forever. Uncle's last stand at Beecher's Hope in Red Dead Redemption turns the camp drunk into something harder and sadder, an old outlaw who dies on the porch defending his adopted family. His fate foreshadows the reckoning that still waits for John, Abigail, and Jack. As the government's long memory closes in on the last remnants of the van der Linde dream, Uncle's death shows what it means to stay on the porch and face the fire. The stories of Tilly, Mary-Beth, and Karen show what happens when someone walks away from it. 3 women, 3 roads out of the same burning house. Tilly Jackson is the clearest proof that the gang did not have to end in blood. From its humble beginnings, her time with the van der Linde gang was a story of survival more than devotion. A former pickpocket taken in as a teenager, she learned to read faces, spin lies, and move through hostile towns without drawing a gun. When the world was changing and the law closed in after Saint Denis, Tilly did something Dutch never truly could. She adapted. She left. In Saint Denis, long after Arthur has begun to understand that the old ways were dying, he runs into Tilly on a busy street. She is well-dressed, poised, walking on the arm of a respectable man named Pierre, now her husband. She is pregnant, living in a proper house, speaking about a future of comfort, security, and quiet. No more nights under canvas, no more speeches about freedom delivered at gunpoint. The same instincts that once helped her spot marks and avoid Pinkertons now help her navigate salons and parlors. Her criminal education becomes social fluency. Her outlaw passed a private scar rather than a death sentence. Mary-Beth Gaskell takes a different road, but the destination is just as far from Dutch's broken philosophy. From the very beginning, she was the gang's gentle con artist, a shy-seeming girl with a notebook who could talk a stranger into handing over a wallet. When the gang collapses, she drifts away quietly, a lost soul who chooses pen and paper over pistol and dynamite. Years later, John can find her on a train platform, no longer a schemer but a published author, signing books and talking about stories instead of robberies. The same talent for reading people and inventing identities becomes the living embodiment of a new life, turning pain into prose, memory into fiction, crime into commentary on civilization. Then there is Karen Jones. Loud, fearless, often drunk, she is the gang's chaos in a red dress, the woman who laughs in the middle of gunfire and turns robberies into theater. But some performances cannot last. After Arthur's death and the final fracture at Beaver Hollow, Karen has no epilogue encounter, no tidy resolution. Camp dialogue and grim hints suggest she simply keeps drinking, long after the family is gone, until the bottle finishes what the Pinkertons started. No husband on her arm, no book in her hands, only silence. Together, their 3 fates form a quiet verdict on Dutch's dream of freedom. The women who truly escape do so not by following him to the bitter end, but by stepping off his path entirely. If Tilly and Mary-Beth can turn lies into livelihoods and stories into survival, what does that say about those who could not let go? Because for others, escape will come far later, and at a much higher price. For some, that price is paid loudly, in blood and thunder. For others, it is paid in a single stray bullet, or in a cold ditch the camera never shows. The story of the Van der Linde gang is not only a tale of legends, it is also a roll call of names that vanish almost as soon as they are spoken. Sean Maguire is the clearest example. His is a story of noise cut short. From its humble beginnings, his presence in camp is chaos and laughter, tall tales and drunken songs, the living embodiment of the gang's rowdy, idealistic self-image. Then, on that dusty road near Rhodes, as the wagon ambush unfolds, he stands there, grinning mid-sentence, basking in the gang's small victory. A single shot from a Gray's rifle takes him through the head. No duel, no last speech, no heroic charge. One moment a voice, the next a corpse in the dirt. That sudden death hits the camp hard because it feels wrong, almost unfair in its swiftness. Yet it is perfectly in tune with the world closing in. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and even the loudest outlaw could be reduced to a body hauled back to camp while Bill and Javier stare in stunned silence. For the gang, Sean's grave is a wound. For the surrounding civilization, it is just another nameless criminal put down. Davy Callender does not even receive that much attention. From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, his fate is already sealed. Wounded in the chaos of the Blackwater ferry robbery, he never makes it out of the blizzard at Coulter. He dies off-screen, coughing and delirious, and is buried in the snow before the main story truly begins. His brother Mac is mentioned only in passing as having been captured and killed by the law. 2 lives, 2 loyalties, swallowed almost entirely by dialogue. Around them, other ghosts crowd the margins. Jenny Kirk, dead from exposure on some earlier winter job. A man named Davy, a boy named Mac, a girl named Jenny. The names blur. Even associates such as the hapless Kieran Duffy are remembered more for the horror of their ends than for any grand philosophy. Their stories unfold in campfire recollections, in grave markers on lonely hillsides, in muttered regrets that most players might miss. These quick, unceremonious deaths stand in stark contrast to the mythic weight placed on Arthur and John. Those central figures receive long arcs, final rides, sunsets heavy with meaning. Sean, Davy, Jenny, and the rest are reminders that most outlaws die as they lived. Abruptly, anonymously, crushed between dreams and delusions. To the world at large, their names mean nothing. Yet to the gang, and to those who follow this saga in the truest sense, they become part of a larger legend, a chorus of lost soul voices echoing behind Dutch's speeches. And as the bodies pile up in the background, one question grows louder. What happens to the leaders who walked them into the fire? The answer, for John Marston, is cruelly simple. There is no real escape. After the gang's collapse, his story becomes a story of penance dressed up as domesticity, of an outlaw trying to pass as a rancher while civilization closes in around him. On the scrubland of Beecher's Hope, from its humble beginnings as a half-built homestead, John tries to trade the gun for the plow. He works the land, breaks horses, mends fences, and hauls feed beside Uncle, whose bad back always seems to flare up when there is real labor to be done. John teaches Jack to ride and to shoot, but also to read, hoping the boy will belong to a different world entirely. Yet even as he plays the role of husband and father, he remains under silent guard. Men from the Bureau of Investigation, led by Edgar Ross, watch from the hills and the rail stations, the living embodiment of a new order that has no patience for the old ways. Abigail sees it clearly. She wants a simple, honest life, in the truest sense, more than anyone. A roof that does not leak, food on the table that was not stolen, a son who grows up knowing school books and sermons, not campfires and gun smoke. But John carries ghosts. The years with Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and the others sit on his shoulders as a weight that work cannot shake. At night, the past is not gone. It is just quieter. The government knows this, and it uses that past as a weapon. Ross and his men arrive not as partners, but as wardens. They take Abigail and Jack, hold them in an undisclosed location, and present John with a choice that is no choice at all. Hunt down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and finally Dutch van der Linde, or lose the only family he has left. Freedom is offered, but only at the price of betrayal. So John rides. Across New Austin, into Mexico, up into the mountains, he tracks the last remnants of his former brothers. Each confrontation is a mirror held to his own history, Bill holed up in a fort, Javier cornered on a cliff, Dutch stepping backwards into legend as he falls from a high ledge, telling John that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying. When it is done, the Bureau thanks him, shakes his hand, and sends him home. Then it kills him. At the barn at Beecher's Hope, Ross surrounds John with soldiers and machine guns, turning a quiet ranch into a firing line. John steps out alone, draws against impossible odds, and is cut down in a storm of bullets. A husband dies. A father dies. An outlaw dies. The government closes the book. But the story does not end there. Abigail dies a few years later, from causes never named, leaving Jack alone with a graveyard and a rifle. The boy who once read adventure novels becomes a vengeful gunslinger, tracking Edgar Ross to a riverbank and ending his life with a single duel. In that moment, Jack inherits more than a revolver. He inherits his father's curse, proving that for the Marstons, the dream of a normal life was always an illusion paid for in blood. Jack Marston becomes the answer to a question the gang never meant to ask. What happens when a child of outlaws survives the story? From the very beginning, his life is framed by campfires and gunfire, by bedtime stories about freedom told by men with bounties on their heads. He grows up between the wagons, chasing dogs through the mud, listening to Uncle's tall tales and Hosea's gentle lessons about the world. For Jack, the Vander Linde camp is school, playground, and church all at once. Abigail pushes him toward a future beyond the gun, while Arthur and Hosea teach him to read, to spell, to lose himself in adventure novels about knights and explorers. Dutch calls him Little Man and promises a world where the gang can live free, away from civilization's reach. It is, in the truest sense, a story of idealistic dreams told to a child in hiding, a fragile philosophy wrapped in warmth and music, even as Pinkertons circle ever closer. Then the illusion dies. First Arthur coughing his life away on a mountaintop, then John gunned down on his own porch, then Abigail, gone from causes never fully named, leaving Jack alone with a headstone and a memory of a man who tried so hard to be better. The boy who once read about heroes becomes the young man who hunts a bureaucrat, tracking Edgar Ross with cold precision across a modernizing West that barely remembers the Vander Linde name. Their final meeting on the riverbank is almost ironic. A government agent who spent years chasing outlaws finds himself facing a quiet, educated gunslinger who learned to shoot from the men Ross helped destroy. Jack calls his name, draws, and kills him in a single, unhesitating duel. No speech, no philosophy, no grand stand for freedom, just revenge. The old ways were dying, yet their last echo speaks with a revolver. What comes after that shot? The game never says. Some imagine Jack as a bounty hunter, turning his pain into a profession, chasing criminals across a world that now travels by train and telegraph. Others see him drifting into outlaw work, a lost soul unable to escape the very life his father died to reject. Perhaps he becomes something in between, a man who reads books by lamplight and still keeps a rifle by the door, forever waiting for the past to ride up his road. In the end, Jack is the living embodiment of the gang's contradictions. Educated yet violent, sensitive yet ruthless, raised on stories of honor yet pulled into the same cycle of blood and betrayal. He carries Dutch's rhetoric, Hosea's wisdom, Arthur's regret, and John's stubborn love into a new century that has no place for cowboys. From its humble beginnings around Dutch's fire to a lonely ranch under a gray sky, the Vander Linde dream narrows down to one young man walking away from a riverbank, leaving footprints that history may never bother to trace. And Jack is not the only survivor forced to negotiate this new world. Others from that campfire family find their own fragile paths through a civilization that has already decided what men like them are worth. Others, however, do not find fragile peace on ranches or in distant cities. Their paths lead not to quiet survival, but to stone walls and gun smoke. For some former Vander Linde soldiers, the end of the story comes not in reflection, but in siege. Bill Williamson is one of them. The same insecure enforcer who once begged for Dutch's approval resurfaces years later as a self-styled warlord at Fort Mercer, a crumbling military post in New Austin. From its humble beginnings as a dusty outpost, the fort becomes the living embodiment of Bill's fear. He surrounds himself with armed men, stolen artillery, and thick walls, trying to hold back not just the United States Army, but time itself. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Bill's answer is to dig in and dare civilization to come and get him. It does. When federal agents drag John Marston back into the outlaw world, Fort Mercer becomes their first target. John rides up under a white flag, offering Bill a chance to walk away, to face consequences and something approaching dignity. Bill only laughs. He slams the gate, turns his cannons outward, and chooses the illusion of power over the possibility of mercy. The assault that follows is brutal and methodical, a story of rifles, dynamite, and the slow dismantling of Bill's borrowed kingdom. Yet even then, when the walls finally fall, Bill refuses to stand and answer. He slips out through the chaos and flees south into Mexico, still running from the reckoning that has chased him since the very beginning. Waiting there is another ghost from that campfire family, Javier Escuella. In Mexico, Javier has woven himself into the tangled web of revolution and counter-revolution, fighting first alongside Abraham Reyes and then cutting deals with the very forces that claim to oppose him. In the truest sense, he becomes a man of no fixed flag, still clinging to Dutch's old philosophy of freedom and resistance, but twisting it to justify whichever side keeps him alive one more day. Is he a believer, a mercenary, or just a lost soul who no longer remembers the difference? John's hunt through Mexico corners Javier in the hills above a river, a far cry from the snow and pines where their bond began. Here, the player decides Javier can be captured and dragged back across the border, or shot as he tries to flee. Yet the outcome is always the same. His cause, his alliances, his fragile dreams of relevance all end in defeat. Loyalty to Dutch does not save him. It only postpones the moment when the New World decides there is no place left for men like him. Bill's last stand comes soon after, at a ruined Mexican fort, surrounded not by loyal comrades, but by soldiers and agents who see him as a problem to be solved. Wounded and cornered, he finally faces John in a broken courtyard, the bravado gone, the warlord reduced to the frightened outlaw he always was. One pull of a trigger ends his chapter, but not the pattern he represents. Because if Bill and Javier fall this way, what does that say about the man they followed, and the government that now wields John as its weapon? The answers to that question lead to one final mountain, one final leader, and one last, devastating choice. That final mountain is not just a place. It is the line between what can change and what never will. Because beneath all the choices and branching moments, this is still a story of fixed tragedies, inevitable betrayals, and a world grinding these outlaws into dust. From the very beginning, Rockstar builds Red Dead Redemption 2 as a legend resting on a rigid skeleton. Certain bones never move, Arthur contracts tuberculosis in 1899, Micah betrays the gang. Dutch falls from visionary leader to paranoid deserter, and the Van der Linde family collapses. Honor, dialogue, even who survives the last shootouts can bend the tone of that legend, but the structure remains. The old ways were dying, and no amount of good deeds could stop it. Arthur's fate is the clearest example. No matter how high his honor climbs, no matter how many strangers he helps or wrongs he rights, he always dies of tuberculosis in 1899. The manner changes, not the outcome. A dishonorable Arthur crawls toward revenge and gets swallowed by Micah and the Pinkertons. A high-honor Arthur faces the sunrise on that mountaintop, at peace with John's escape and his own failures. But he still dies, because the world of Red Dead Redemption must already be missing him when John's story begins. This is not cruelty for its own sake, it is continuity. John's guilt, Dutch's absence in RDR2, and the gang's ghostly presence across the West all depend on Arthur being gone. In the truest sense, he becomes the living embodiment of a generation that fought, bled, and then vanished before the so-called progress of civilization. Micah's end is more flexible on the surface, yet canon still asserts itself. In every path, Micah dies on that snowy peak years later, during John's epilogue. Dutch appears, silent and unreadable, then shoots Micah before disappearing again. Whether John or Dutch fires the final bullet in gameplay, the story frames it as Dutch finally severing his last poisonous tie. RDR1 confirms that Dutch drifted for years, leading smaller gangs, haunted and half-broken, before his own death plunge from a cliff. The mountain at Beecher's Hope is the bridge between those two Dutch Van der Lindes. Around that fixed arc, fan theories bloom. Some imagine Sadie returning from South America, still hunting bounties. Others see Jack growing into a professional writer rather than merely an outlaw echo of his father. Many wonder whether Dutch truly regretted losing Arthur and Hosea, or only regretted losing control. The games answer softly, in brief silences, in half-finished sentences, in the way Dutch stares down at Micah's body, and then walks away. So each playthrough becomes one more legend told around the same campfire. The dates, deaths, and destinations are set, but the tone of that history shifts with every choice. From its humble beginnings to its bitter end, the van der Linde gang lives on as a framework of fixed events, filled in by countless personal versions of the same doomed ride. And that ride is not over yet, because one last outlaw still has a debt to pay, and one last family still has to be broken to finish the cycle. Because that last debt and that last broken family are not just personal tragedies, they are the final echoes of a much larger story, one that reaches far beyond a single gang hiding in the pines. The van der Linde gang is not only a collection of criminals, it is the living embodiment of a country arguing with itself as the 19th century collapses into the 20th. From its humble beginnings, the gang mirrors real bands of displaced drifters and outlaws who haunted the American West in those final decades. Former Confederates who refused surrender, indigenous warriors forced off their lands, freedmen chased by lynch mobs, immigrant laborers discarded when the rails were laid. Many ended up on the margins, trading law for survival. Dutch gathers those same cast-off fragments of civilization and calls them family, turning their desperation into a philosophy. In Dutch's speeches, there is more than empty bravado. He steals the language of the Republic itself. Freedom, self-reliance, resistance to tyranny, his campfire sermons sound eerily close to the rhetoric of revolution and frontier democracy. But there is a catch. Who gets that freedom? Who pays for that self-reliance? Dutch talks about the people while robbing the people's trains, condemns civilization while spending its money in Saint Denis, rails against tyranny while becoming a tyrant in the truest sense within his own camp. That contradiction is no accident. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but the myths stayed beautiful. Dutch is a story of American ideals pushed past their limits, of dreams and delusions fused until no one can tell them apart. His downfall, and the gang's destruction by Pinkertons and corporate rail interests, echoes the real consolidation of power as industrialists, bankers, and a stronger federal government crushed small-time outlaws and local autonomy in the name of order. Here the pattern interrupts. This is not just a white outlaw tragedy fading into the sunset. Through Charles, Lenny, and Tilly, Rockstar forces the camera to linger on race and class, on who is allowed to be part of the legend and who is written out of it. Charles, of native and black heritage, fights for a home that civilization has already decided he cannot have. Lenny, brilliant and idealistic, dies faceless in a bank stairwell, his body swallowed by the very city that promised opportunity. Tilly, a black woman born into exploitation, survives by walking away from the myth altogether, building a quiet, respectable life that the game almost whispers rather than sings. In the end, the gang becomes a story of loyalty and betrayal, of freedom promised and freedom denied. It is a cautionary tale about how noble words can excuse monstrous acts, and how extremism grows from wounded pride as much as from injustice. But it is also a eulogy for a version of America that never really existed outside of stories, wanted posters, and the fading memories of lost soul outlaws riding toward a horizon that was already gone. From the very beginning, the van der Linde gang was not just a collection of thieves, but a fragile idea held together by three men around a campfire. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur shaped the philosophy that drew every lost soul into their orbit, a story of freedom and family, of robbing the rich and corrupt as a crooked answer to a crooked world. From its humble beginnings, that dream felt righteous. It felt unbreakable. It was neither. Their downfall is written in the deaths that mark the trail behind them. In Saint Denis, Hosea is executed on the steps of a modern bank, his quiet wisdom silenced in a city that represents the civilization Dutch claimed to resist. Moments later, Lenny Summers, young, idealistic, the living embodiment of what the gang might have become, is cut down on a rooftop as the heist collapses into chaos. Earlier, Sean McGuire, loud, reckless, and full of stories, dies in an ambush on a road street, grinning 1 second and gone the next. A cruel punchline in a feud that should never have mattered so much. Kieran Duffy's fate is even darker. Once an enemy, then a nervous ally searching for belonging, he is kidnapped, tortured, and returned headless on a horse, a message from the O'Driscolls that the old ways were dying and mercy was already dead. Arthur Morgan's final ride up the mountain completes that grim procession. Tuberculosis has already claimed his body, but his last choice, help John escape or chase the gang's dwindling money, reveals the truth of his soul. He dies facing the sunrise or the storm, depending on his honor, yet the result is the same. The era ends with a man who tried to be better, too late. Years later, John Marston's last stand at Beecher's Hope mirrors that sacrifice, a father walking out into a wall of federal gunfire so that Abigail and Jack might step into a different world. And still, some survive. Charles Smith endures the carnage, helps John build Beecher's Hope, then heads north toward Canada, chasing a quieter life far from the reach of the U.S. government. Sadie Adler turns grief into purpose as a bounty hunter, then sails for South America, vanishing into rumor and legend. Tilly Jackson marries, has a child, and settles into domestic stability in Saint Denis, while Mary-Beth Gaskill trades pickpocketing for the pen, becoming a novelist and turning outlaw memories into stories on a page. Pearson opens a general store in Rhodes, his campfire cooking replaced by ledger books and small-town gossip. Uncle, impossibly, drifts along beside John and later Jack, a living reminder that laziness can sometimes outlast bullets. Yet no one truly escapes untouched. Charles carries scars and the memory of every burial. Sadie's new horizon is stained by the men she hunted. Tilly and Mary-Beth may have found peace, but their past rides with them in every quiet moment. Even Pearson, even Uncle, glance backward when the sun sets just right. In the truest sense, the gang never leaves them. It lingers as guilt, as nostalgia, as a half-remembered song from a camp that no longer exists. Across this saga, every member has been followed from first meeting to final bullet or quiet fade out, their scattered fates stitched into one continuous timeline. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, now stands whole. Yet the question remains, what does that legacy do to the ones who outlived it, and to the world that replaced them? In that question lies the wound that never quite closes. Because from its humble beginnings to its final betrayals, the Van der Linde gang was never just a roster of outlaws. It was a fragile answer to a brutal world, a traveling experiment in whether freedom, family, and philosophy could stand against civilization closing in. From the very beginning, Dutch promised a life beyond fences and factories, a story of idealism clashing with reality. Around the fire, his speeches painted the gang as the living embodiment of resistance, men and women who stole not for greed but for survival, and for the dream of a different order. Yet every member landed somewhere different on that line, between dream and delusion, between loyalty and self-preservation, between the open horizon and the cold bars of a cell. Arthur Morgan sat at the center of that storm. An enforcer raised to believe in Dutch's vision, he discovered too late that the world was changing and the old ways were dying. His tragedy is not just that tuberculosis claims him on a mountaintop, it is that clarity comes only when time has almost run out. In the truest sense, he finally sees that the gang's greatest victories are not in banks robbed or lawmen killed, but in small acts of kindness, saving John's family, protecting the weak, choosing mercy when cruelty would be easier. Dutch tragedy runs in the opposite direction. Here is a man who could inspire greatness, who could turn a camp of misfits into a family and make them feel chosen rather than discarded. Yet he cannot live up to his own ideals, cannot accept a world where his words no longer bend reality. As plans fail and bodies fall, his philosophy curdles into paranoia, then into abandonment. The man who preached loyalty walks away from Hosea's memory, from Arthur's outstretched hand, from any version of himself that might have been redeemed. That is why every betrayal, every death, feels personal rather than abstract. Sean's easy laughter cut short in Rhodes, Lenny's bright future drowned in Saint Denis smoke, Kieran's mutilated body dumped as a warning, Hosea's calm wisdom silenced on the bank steps. Each loss is a piece of a found family being carved away. The camp chores, the songs, the quiet conversations make this more than a gang. They make it a home that the story then methodically destroys. So who truly wins here? John gets a ranch and a brief taste of peace, only to be hunted down in another chapter. Charles and Sadie carve out their own paths, but neither escapes the scars of what was lost. If there is any victory, It lives in those fleeting sacrifices: a boy sent to safety, a friend given one last chance, a dying man choosing to face the sunrise instead of the darkness. In the end, the fate that hits hardest reveals something in the one who carries it. Is the heart drawn to Dutch, the fallen prophet, to Arthur, the late convert, to John, the doomed survivor, or to the nameless, loyal souls who died believing the dream was still real? The answer says as much about the stories that linger as it does about the people who cannot quite let them go. Because in the end, this is not just a roll call of graves and disappearances. It is a story of how each outlaw carries a different piece of the same broken dream, and how those pieces only truly come together when others look back and decide what mattered most. For some, the wound will always be Arthur on that ridge, watching the sun bleed over a world that no longer had room for him. For others, it will be Lenny falling on the rooftops of St. Denis, Hosea smiling through the noose, or Kieran's headless body dumped as a warning that loyalty meant nothing in Micah's new order. Which fate cuts deepest? Which death or disappearance refuses to fade, long after the credits roll and the campfire has gone cold? There is also the question that hangs over everything, from its humble beginnings to that final cliff: Dutch van der Linde himself. Was Dutch, in the truest sense, a believer who lost his way, or a gifted manipulator who finally ran out of roads to run down? When he walks away from Arthur in the mountains, when he abandons Micah with a single bullet years later, is there regret in those eyes, or only exhaustion and the dim recognition that the world was changing and the old ways were dying with him? That cliff in Red Dead Redemption is more than a drop into empty space. It is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy cracking under its own weight, of dreams and delusions finally colliding with civilization. Did he jump because he could not bear a cage, or because he could not bear to look in a mirror any longer? The comments below are the only place left for that trial to continue, for Dutch's legacy to be judged by those who have ridden every mile of his story. For those who want to ride further, there are trails this video has only marked, not fully ridden. There is Dutch's psychology, from the very beginning as an idealistic thief quoting philosophers, to the haunted drifter hunted by John Marston. There are Sadie Adler's missing years after she boards that boat for South America, her legend echoing in rumors and half-told tales. There is Jack Marston's future, that quiet boy on the edge of the fire who becomes the last shadow of the van der Linde name in a world that no longer remembers what it cost. To keep those stories alive, engagement is not decoration. It is survival. A like tells the tale that this long-form narrative breakdown was worth the ride. A subscription and a bell turned on say that there is still an audience for sagas of freedom and family, of loyalty and betrayal, of outlaws crushed between the promise of the frontier and the hard steel of civilization. The camp is gone now. The wagons are empty, the fire pit is ash, and the voices that once argued and laughed and plotted under the stars have all fallen silent. Yet as long as someone remembers Lenny's jokes, Hosea's wisdom, Arthur's last ride, or Dutch's final step into the void, the gang is not entirely dead. The flame is out, but the embers remain, waiting for the next story to lean in, listen close, and decide what really happened out there in the dark.